just to give you my perspective, I don't consider myself to be an expert on that, but I will say my vantage point is that of the litigation coordinator at Phelps Dunbar. I'm in our New Orleans office, so I'm a coordinator for our litigation group here. My firm has 11 offices ranging from London to through the South and Texas. I just say that so that I'm explaining my perspective for what that's worth. I do serve on some management committees here at the firm, including our hiring committee and our ethics committee. And so that's kind of the, I guess, the perspective that I bring with me to this for what that's worth. I'm happy to discuss, be challenged, or hear comments, but I'll share some of the trends that we're seeing and maybe what we're seeing on a macro and micro level with technology, and then some of what we're seeing about certain industries that are more or less affected by economic downturns and those types of things. Again, I'm happy if Nicole sees or we hear any questions or comments as we go. And I am proud to serve as the president of the Tulane Alumni Association right now, and another reason I've always enjoyed this. First, obviously, not to state the obvious, but we're in a time of dramatic change in the legal industry. Some of those things are obvious, some of those things are more nuanced, but we're seeing that, and I don't know that it's over. I was just on a panel of judges and lawyers yesterday speaking to our State Bar Association, and I think all agreed that some of the ramifications of not just the pandemic, but some of the related aftermath, we still don't know what the contours of all that's going to be. And so while we know there's change, we don't know how far wide and how long-standing some of it will be because some of it's still unfolding. But for what it's worth, I will say we always talk about the need to adapt and innovate. We warn that the law firms, lawyers, and those in the legal industry that stay stagnant or don't innovate or evolve with changing conditions run the risk of becoming a blockbuster video and perhaps becoming a commodity as the economic downturn or market conditions sometimes turn unfavorable. We find that those who are not nimble, who are not able to innovate or change with the times, oftentimes either suffer financially or have subject to rate sensitivities, those types of things, if they're not able to set themselves apart. And just like in the market for other goods or services, we have to do that too. I say that as a backdrop for what I'll mention in a moment with a little more specificity, but now more than ever, I think it's quite clear that those who are able to be nimble, who are able to be efficient and able to be, like I said, set themselves apart from the crowd are the ones that I think are going to have the brightest future. And I say that both from a law firm and a lawyer or even a legal service provider in general, and I do believe that. One example of that, and I'll lead into, is the use of technology. The technology and the digital age have had profound effects on the legal industry and how we provide those services. Multiple ways. When I started at my law firm after graduating from Tulane 20 years ago, we had one of the largest and most attractive spaces in our 5 floors in the tower was the library. And there were people who came into the library every week and just updated books. You all will probably remember the pocket parts of all the new decisions and all the books. And people who maintain these paper copies and the updated copies and the revisions and the new versions, et cetera. Almost all of that is gone. We still have a much smaller library that has electronic librarians in it, and that's part of the digital age. The people who stuff the pocket parts, we don't even keep those books anymore. They're just not used. They're on bookshelves and they look nice, but they're rarely used, just as a part of how we've gone to a more paperless industry. Just like that happens, we had teams of file clerks and paralegals here at the firm, and I'll give you an example. We're 100 lawyers in our New Orleans office. There were dozens of file clerks and paralegals here. We still have them, but it's a small fraction of those people. Again, as we've gone to a more paperless system, the need for these people who just maintain file cabinets and file cabinets of documents is just not there anymore. What does that mean? Well, when we renovated our office recently, we were able to put in more conference rooms because there was so much interior space that was just not being used by those folks anymore. And so a lot of law firms have been able to downsize or reduce their footprint or their space because of things like that. That may not be an industry trend, although I think it is, that's maybe so important, but it's illustrative of the broader point, which is as we've gone into the digital age, as we use technology, there are other changes that come about as a result. In one of our cases this year where the witnesses were located in London at a time where people couldn't travel either to or even within London in certain cases, we've learned to take depositions by video, something that was almost unheard of, at least in the type of work that I do 2 years ago. That would never have happened. But the courts are trying to adapt. The clients are expecting to adapt. Clients are having to adapt, and so we are too. Just to give an example, again, with the digital age, I also serve on the firm's EDiscovery committee, and what we're seeing is tremendous changes in the way data is done. When I graduated from law school, a couple of my friends went to large law firms and lived literally in New York City while they went through warehouses of documents. Some of you may be familiar with that. Those document reviews were long, they were expensive, and they were intensive. As we've gotten away from paper records and warehouses of paper records, those things are being done differently now. And now we're using artificial intelligence to search for documents, digital documents. We're using vendors and computer programs that are now searching and producing and grouping those documents from the comfort of an air-conditioned room and a desktop rather than some steamy warehouse in a remote location. There's a lot of good about that. Just like depositions that may be now taken remotely, the costs are far less when you're able to do this digital production of EDiscovery, or what they call electronically stored information, ESI. That itself has become a big industry. And so while we've shifted away from the Iron Mountains, the warehouses of documents that you all may be familiar with that we used to do, we've gone into electronic versions of that, and vendors who can store those documents and store that or host that data for us. But that's an important shift too, because it's producing more efficiencies. It's cost effective in most instances over the old system, and it saves a lot of time. And so that allows things to happen, on a faster basis, generally speaking. Let me say that with all the things, what I'm about to say, a lot of them are with generalizations, and so certainly you can find exceptions to every generalization, but I hope it's helpful to kind of see what we're seeing, at least from our level at my firm and its size. Again, as we talk about efficiencies, clients are expecting us to be able to provide those efficiencies, and I recently had the federal judge that I worked for after law school came and spoke to our young lawyers about what he's seeing, and he was adamant and gave many examples of where not just the courts, but juries and jurors are expecting lawyers to be nimble and efficient with technology. The days of just expecting the young lawyer to be effective with EDiscovery and technology are gone. Why? Now we're seeing with the courts that are open and the courts who are even able to have juries in this pandemic are getting away from having paper copies. It's something else to touch, something else to have to find out a way to keep clean or sanitized. So what are the courts doing? The courts are looking to the lawyers to make paperless presentations or presentations that are digital so that the court and the court staff and the jurors are all kept safe. Again, that's another instance where we're being expected to be proficient and efficient with electronic data, electronically stored information, the ESI I just referenced. I think some things we may go back to, some things we won't, but I think we all know that the more and more we become efficient with technology, the less likely we are to go back to the old way. And so that's just my observation, but I think that we're starting to see it, and it was something that the judge commented on when speaking to our lawyers, which is that juries are becoming, even in some instances, suspicious of lawyers who claim that they're not familiar with technology or not able to use it, that they have a hard time understanding that. So we need to respond to that, I think, as lawyers and law firms in this industry, because now it's not just that our clients appreciate it, it's that the courts and the juries and the others are expecting or demanding of it. I'll mention, just for a way of example, California and some other states have now put into their ethical rules that lawyers have an ethical duty to be competent and or proficient with the use of electronic discovery. And so when you're seeing that becoming an actual professional obligation, it also kind of blends into the expectation that we'll be able to do those things on, again, a cost-effective and efficient basis. I was asked to maybe mention some of what's happening in the industry. Again, this is our perspective, and you can certainly find exceptions or and I welcome different opinions. Aside from the pandemic, the oil and gas industry has been hit obviously very hard. The price of oil, price of a barrel of oil has gone to a historical low. In fact, frankly, to a price that some people would have thought was impossible. What does that mean? That has ramifications for the shipping that services the offshore oil fields. When the price of oil is as low as it is, it's not practically feasible or economically there's no economic incentive to go offshore for some of the oil. So that may affect the energy companies, but it's also going to affect the shipping companies who provide vessels to go on and off to the platforms, the helicopter companies that deliver folks out to the platforms offshore, those types of things, and on and on and on. So aside from the pandemic, we've seen volatility in that sector, and probably will for some time. Other sectors that we see, the shipping sectors are having to adjust when the price of shipping through the Panama Canal is changing, or when commodities are either being less needed or needed more quickly. Sometimes they'll go to San Francisco and not come through the Panama Canal. And so that's just an example of the types of things that we're seeing, both in an economic downturn and then sometimes intensified by COVID. So we're seeing some of that, obviously, in some of the casualty sector. If people are offshore less, there may be less injuries and those types of things that some of the Admiralty crew work with here, but then other things may be up. And so generally speaking, I will say that if my son or daughter were entering law school today and they asked me, I would tell them that some of the sectors that aren't being affected by the economic downturn are the intellectual property sector. Their patent registrations are just, I don't see any dip in what our firm does for those. I don't see any dip or much of an effect on the litigation from either patent infringement or trademark infringement or licensing disputes. That seems to be relatively unaffected by the downturn or COVID. Similarly, if anything, we see growth in the cyber and data privacy sectors. We may be remote, we may be at home, but the cyber issues and data privacy issues have not been affected by the economic downturn. And if anything, that sector seems to be growing. I'll mention that 2 years ago, some of you may recall, the Supreme Court decided the TC Heartland decision, which was a sea change in venue. Previously, I believe 90% of all patent litigation was in the Eastern District of Texas because of the way the venue rules have been interpreted. Probably about the other 10% was in Delaware because so many corporations are headquartered there. Now that the Supreme Court changed that rule, we're seeing more patent litigation in federal courts across the country. And so that's arguably offering more opportunities for lawyers who are in the intellectual property and patent space, because that litigation, frankly, wouldn't be found in Atlanta, Louisiana, for example, very often. It'd be a rarity. Now it's more frequent. So I would say intellectual property seems untouched. The insurance sector never seemed to miss a beat, both on a domestic and a London market. In our firm, and my friends who are at other firms seem to have the same view. And as I said, cyber and data privacy seems to be growing. Relatively unaffected are the tax lawyers, tax law firms who work in that space, according to not just my firm, but what I'm seeing with other colleagues at other firms. And I don't predict there'll be a lot of volatility there. The human resources and employment sectors seem to be doing just fine. What I don't know is that there'll be a drop off or a dip as things start to normalize, whatever that means. That's a little harder for me to predict. And as I said, it seems like the retail sectors are down. Some of my friends and colleagues, both here and at other firms in the transactional work, have seen something of a dip as deals are postponed or put off or sometimes killed as a result of COVID. There has been some volatility there. I don't think that's permanent. I think that's just a temporal thing. But again, that's just my opinion based on some of what we're seeing. And then lastly, like I said, the retail sectors have seen a lot of volatility for obvious reasons. And we've seen, major retailers file for bankruptcy, those types of things, or we think bankruptcy is probably imminent, maybe postponed by some temporary situations, PPP loans, those types of things. Those are just some of my observations. I want to be respectful of time. I'm happy to answer any questions there are, or disagreements or what have you. But I hope there's some value, at least in seeing from our vantage point, what we're seeing among our 11 offices, as well with some of the firms that we're working with. Nicole?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. Yes, we do have a couple of questions. So I'll start with one. It says, have you heard anything in regards to California court systems currently having a moratorium or refusing to hear cases against school districts? My friend is a lawyer and full-time advocate for special needs children in some of the poorest areas of Los Angeles County. Thanks.
Let me say my perspective, we do have some litigation in California, but my perspective on California is limited. So take this with a grain of salt. We are seeing some issues here in Louisiana and in some of our other offices with the school districts, both charter schools and the historic school boards. They've got a lot of issues that they're dealing with. And so there was something of a moratorium here, even in Louisiana for a while. But the need, as the courts have reopened and the issues have, I think, forced the court's hand. And so I really can't predict much, but my $2 prediction, for what it's worth, is that a moratorium won't be able to last too long based on the question, because of the needs, and the courts are getting back. And frankly, if in some areas where the state courts have been behind, folks have been finding a way to get into federal court to get some relief. Limited perspective, but that's what I would say to that. Thanks.
Thanks. And we have another question. What advice do you have for an attorney outside of New Orleans looking to come back? And to follow up on something you said, what can set an attorney apart from a law firm perspective? So that's a two-part question.
Sure. Well, let me say, from the New Orleans sector, there are some areas that are, like I said, almost unaffected by COVID and even the economic downturn. I'll just give you some examples. And so you might think about that. Litigation, casualty litigation took a hold. When insurance companies are giving rebates, on dividends, that tells you something. There have been fewer accidents, fewer those types of things. But generally, the insurance sector has been strong. The admiralty sector has seen a little slowdown, but not absolute. And part of that's the oil and gas issue, which I mentioned. I think that'll rebound. The question is when. And frankly, I think a lot of that's tied to the price of oil and what's happening with that in terms of the exploration and the related issues. I did mention that I think that the intellectual property is a strong sector from what I'm seeing, not just because of the patent issue, but because of there's just no real downturn. Those things are really unaffected, or seem to be unaffected by COVID and economic downturns. So those are some thoughts. I still think that there's a need for litigation. And also, I frankly think it's a great time to be a young lawyer, because young lawyers tend to be proficient with technology and able to adapt quickly to those things, and clients are demanding it. And so I think that's something to highlight, something to keep in mind. Obviously, those are not the only things, but we're seeing people who are finding a way to work not necessarily in a large law office. And so there's a lot of positive about that. Frankly, clients are not coming into offices as much as they used to. And so the need for some of that space, both internally and externally, I've mentioned about the staffing issues and the libraries, But frankly, we're learning to stay connected through video conferences and telephone conferences more than ever, and I think that trend will continue. So, and then in terms of coming to New Orleans, or I think the question was a young lawyer, Nicole, was it? What was the second part?
The first part was coming to New Orleans. The other part was how can an attorney set themselves apart from a law firm's perspective?
Yeah, I think being efficient is important these days, and being able to utilize electronic resources and research and those types of things. Obviously, you always need to be able to communicate, but I think the emphasis on the product is as important as ever because of the efficiencies that are being demanded, and the way we're having to be adaptive. And that's frankly on the hiring committee, that's what we look for. We look for legal acumen, but we also, look for someone who can be nimble and can adapt with some days, the unexpected being thrown at you. So I hope that helps.
Yes, that's true. That's valuable in all industries, I think, especially right now. Another question is, I've seen more masters of law degrees out there. How does that compare to a JD in the hiring process?
So I do the hiring not just for my group, but I serve on the hiring committee, and I think that there's a lot of value in the JD and the masters, but primarily only in certain sectors. And again, this is just my opinion. Tax lawyers, I think it's wonderful to have a master's in law or LLM degree, because that shows, a broad range of expertise. I know that some of my admiralty lawyer partners, they notice when someone's gotten a master's in admiralty, or whatever the degree may be called. But I don't think that runs all sectors. I do think that in the intellectual property, you certainly notice if I see that someone's gotten an advanced degree, but I don't think it's required. I don't think that there's a view. Well, let me say this, the experience in the product trumps all else, no matter what the degree. And so I think if you show some experience in that area, that could probably match up, although there are some people who would probably give extra points for someone who has an LLM in taxation or an LLM in admiralty or whatever that particular specialty may be looking for. I hope that helps.
Yes, I hope so. If not, please.
I think it's a feather in the cap, though not required.
Okay, and is it something, I guess, that helps people with their transition into the career? If they've not been previous in law, they have experience in the field.
Yes, I would agree with that. Absolutely.
We have a lot of people transitioning right now, so I know that that's a big question a lot of people have.
I think that people, for example, in the accounting, who have accounting backgrounds, for example, if we're looking for someone that relates to that, or maybe servicing those clients, I think that's another feather in their cap, and that's something that they should tout. And maybe that goes to the question of the person who you just mentioned, the question before, which is emphasize your strengths. Find a way to get that in there, your background, your experience, your specialization in a certain field, because those things do matter, at least to me, and I think most of my colleagues.
Okay, good. I'm looking to see, checking my two boards here to see if we have any other questions real quick. And if not, we have a small enough group that we could have everyone introduce themselves and just kind of, in the interest of networking, of course, it's just what we're also trying to do here. So I will unmute you and ask you to please ask our participants, and if you have other questions, you can still send them in. But in the meantime, just maybe introduce yourself and let us know what your interest in the legal field is. So, Eileen? Eileen Paragua? I have you unmuted, but maybe we'll... Luke, you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, my video isn't working. I'm not sure why. So yeah, hi, thank you everyone for your time. I currently work in technical recruiting and also am leading the committee for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and have recently started looking more seriously into employment law. and studying that and kind of combining those interests and looking more into studying for the LSAT and going to law school. So still in early stages, but that's my interest here.
Great. Stefan?
Oh, hi, how you doing? Thank you for hosting. Yeah, I'm actually in the process of applying to law school. So it's a career change for me. I spent 20 years working in investment banking, primarily in financial restructuring, securities, and the such. So trying to get a insight into the legal profession, how things are working, and your vision for how things are going to progress. Obviously in the digital age.
Hi, Stefan.
How you doing?
Sure.
Nice to meet you. Thank you.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
And we'll come back to that question because that brings up a question in my mind. Colin?
Hi. My name is Colin Kiker. I'm an attorney out in Beaumont, just across the state line in Texas. And I'm just always curious about what's happening in the legal field, especially back in New Orleans, because I'm the one who asked what it's going to take to come back. So I like to keep my ear to the ground and just hear what's happening, see if anything sounds like a good lead to follow up on.
Yeah, we'll come back to those. I just want to be respectful of time, and I'd like to hear from I don't know who else is there.
Sure. We have Mark. Mark DeCiccio? I said that right? DeCiccio? Or maybe not. How about Meredith?
Hi there, everyone. This is Meredith Bambrick tuning in from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, where it's getting pretty late. I am one of those people who did an LLM. I was in the first LLM class for international development. There were only 2 of us in the class. So I was there to study at the Payson Center with Professor Crawford. And I took a very non-traditional path, and I'm now working on a USAID funded project, the operations side of and contracts, as well as the business enabling environment sector, part of our project here.
Wow, great.
Great. So thank you. And I'm trying to, if anyone else has a question or would like to introduce themselves, maybe you're just having audio problems, just chat and I'll see if I can make that happen for you. But let's go back to one of those questions. I think it was Stefan, you're coming from investment banking. I heard you say a lot about data analysis and Chris, and can you maybe talk about how the connection there?
Yeah, well, let me just say, we recently hired someone who had a financial industry background because there's a lot that they bring to the table, and specifically that sector. And so it's wonderful to have I think you have an MBA, highlight that. That's great. And that'll be able to translate to certain clients. Does that translate to all of them? No, I won't say it would, but it's certainly going to be attractive to some. And I think particularly from a transactional standpoint, your understanding of all that in the finance, I'm not I'm not trying to push you that way because you may love litigation, but as we look at the divide generally between transaction and litigation, I think you'd be of particular interest, given your background, to the transactional, the mergers folks, the purchase, the corporate law, those types of things. And I find that true. We try to make sure when we see candidates with that background that my partners in the business group are aware of it, at least have a chance to look over the resume. And so that is something to sell. And do what you love as you get into it, but I think I oftentimes see people gravitate that way because those skills are appreciated. Yes. The background is appreciated. So right. I very much think that. And on the data, look, while I'm generalizing, I will say that it's we've got to be nimble these days. I can't underscore enough, because as there's pressures on these legal departments, historically, you could go into a field and you just had it made. It's not the way these days. Companies are going through dramatic changes. There's pressure on the general counsel to conserve what they're spending on, legal budgets. And I mentioned those days where they had teams of lawyers in a warehouse, coming through documents. Companies aren't built to have that anymore, or at least most companies, some of the largest even. If you think about think about a publicly traded company that has parking lots across America. There are a number of them. Can you imagine what forces they're having on them right now when the parking lots are all empty and they're already paying for the leases at high rates and some of these things on those what used to be cash cows? I just say that because that's putting a lot of pressure on the in-house legal departments to either save money or, frankly, not fight about things that they ordinarily would have invested in or would have, stood up for. That's just great financial pressure that they're being put under, and so you're having to understand that, and you're having to adapt to changes in circumstances that they're under. And I say that for all those sectors, the data analysis, those types of things. I think that that's something that clients want us to know their businesses these days. The days where I have a client and I just pass them on to somebody down the hall to service them for their employment needs. That's not happening as much anymore. They want specialization so that the lawyer that they get understands their industry, understands their business, and can service them efficiently. I can't underscore that enough. That's a change that we're seeing, I think, pretty much in almost all sectors, except for some of the most kind of historic. And some of those, even the shipping lawyers who've had these relationships for years and years and years, and law firms that all come through the same P&I clubs out of London, they're having to adapt. They're having to see adaptability as something that they're having to be able to provide. And then as far as the employment, the person who mentioned the employment, there are certainly a lot of opportunity. I don't see that going away. Sometimes that tends to be a little more volatile, and not all in a bad way. But when you have a new Affordable Health Care Act, lawyers are having to be able to shift to speak to employees about what does that mean, what changes do they need to make, how do they do those things, and then it may lull off for a little while. And so I'm not saying that all the volatility is bad, but we see kind of, a little more fluctuation in what they're getting and what the clients are needing. Obviously, it was very quiet for a while during COVID for a lot of the employment lawyers, and then it kind of came roaring back as workplace issues were popping up, and, issues that we previously didn't see were popping up. And so, I think it was quiet. Just looking at the statistics from my firm and our offices, it was quiet in the employment sector for a while, but I don't think it's quiet down on the 18th floor now. I think they're kind of going. And so for what it's worth, that's just my observation. We saw the transaction sector during the start of COVID. That's probably where I saw the most downswing because, again, deals were being postponed or put off, or in some instances was reconsidered. And a lot of that's come back. But some other sectors, the litigation group, I do a lot of trade secret, intellectual property, and those types of claims. We really haven't had a downturn. We maybe had, a couple weeks where we weren't hearing a lot of things. But that has been surprisingly unaffected, and my partners that are actually dealing with cyber policies, they're opening new files every day. I mean, it's something that is everyone else may have been remote, but I'm telling you, the cyber criminals and some of the issues that companies are experiencing are not going away, and if anything, I think they're increasing and on the rise. And so that's why I said if I had a son or a daughter in law school, I would tell them that's one sector that they can probably bank on being around and being strong for at least the foreseeable future, at least.
That's scary to me, but I'm sure there's a lot there. Why don't we come back to two of our participants here, let them introduce themselves real quick. Mark, you want to go ahead? Or maybe we're having audio.
I'm not able to hear Mark.
Mark? Not hearing you too well. How about Eileen?
Yes, hi, thank you. Sorry about that, had an audio issue before. I'm actually a former attorney. I practiced in New York State. I'm actually from here in New Orleans, but I went to law school and practiced in New York for over 10 years. Actually, I specialized in litigation and intellectual property, but I'm now wondering if I'm specifically looking for appellate sort of work, legal research and writing work, and trying to figure out if there's a market for that here. I clerked for 2 federal judges, 1 state judge, so that kind of law clerk kind of work here in New Orleans.
Oh, great. Well, I mean, having clerked at federal court myself, I generally, for my group and what we do, much of which is in federal court, as you know, and an intellectual property attorney, I consider that a huge plus, and your writing skills. And so, I think for your instance, 10 years ago, maybe it would have been harder for you to find a niche here. I don't think that's the case now. Look, we're doing things remotely. We need efficiencies. We need people who know, federal and state court. And so I think see all those as positives. And you heard what I said. You may have a different view, but I am not seeing the intellectual property sector slowing down. I'm not just talking about here. I'm just, I don't want to say it's increasing, but it's sure staying solid from what I'm seeing. And that's just not just here. It's my friends who do that work. And so I think there's a variety of ways you can sell your skills, Eileen, and I'd be happy to look at a resume, but I think there are other firms that would be also interested in what your background, what you're able to provide. I did have friends, about a decade and a half ago, I had a couple friends go off and start an appellate practice. And I think it was hard for them to find steady enough work. I think they would say this if they were on the camera, steady enough, and the type of work that they wanted to just do that. But there is a need, and I will share with you that I know a couple of lawyers that ghostwrite briefs for some lawyers where they don't find that's a strength. And so I'm happy to talk to you offline about some of that, because I am seeing people do that. And again, while we're remote and the remote is the new norm, that's an efficiency you provide.
Thank you so much. That's really encouraging. That really answered my question, because I wasn't sure if there was a need. And that's actually that kind of work, ghostwriting briefs, is specifically something I'm looking for, because I do know it's a very specific skill. A lot of attorneys before that I work with don't want to do it, don't like to do it.
Yeah.
I actually love to do it, and thank you.
No, I really believe that. I really believe that I have some friends of mine that are very successful, but that's not where they either want to spend their time, or they may not find that's their strength. And so they are in a need, and they are looking for someone who can provide that, right? Because that's important. So I'm encouraged by what you can provide.
Great. Thank you. We also have another question on document retention. Stefan?
I did have a question. So you did mention like the space-saving benefits of going electronic, and the shift to that. What is the current philosophy at your law firm, and then also admissibility in court regarding not having the original document? So can that be, once you scan them in, it's in electronic format, is that now admissible in court, or do you now have to warehouse that somewhere else off-site in order to bring that up if required in court as having the original? I'm just kind of curious about that point.
So I didn't want to bore you all by mentioning some of the document issues, but let me tell you, my firm about 5-6 years ago changed our document retention policy. We were spending over $500,000 a year in document storage at Iron Mountain and those types of things between our New Orleans and our Baton Rouge office. This firm was started in the 1850s, and we had documents from the 1800s that were still being stored. Those days are gone. And what we now tell our clients what our document retention policy is, and the courts have adapted to it. Imagine how the courts had to adapt to it after Katrina, when warehouses were flooded or destroyed. And so it may be more profound from a local level, but we're doing some litigation in another state. The federal courts don't even require original affidavits anymore. What we're normally doing is we have to pay attention to local rules, but normally we get a document custodian, and that could be someone from the information IT space who says these are the records and they were stored and they're, I'm producing them in their native format, whatever is required for the circumstances. But it's absolutely adapting, because the paper records are becoming rare, everything's being stored, we're finding ways of dealing with them. Emails are now considered a writing, and that even says that in our Code of Civil Procedure. And so what used to be maybe have questions about authenticity of those types of things, that's waning rapidly. To the extent that those issues are still there, it rarely comes up anymore. And again, think about storms, and how people didn't have original wills anymore, but they had to, courts found a way to adapt to those types of things. They had copies, and those things I think are more and more as we go to paperless, and as the ability and the cost of maintaining large paper warehouses. I mean, the doctors aren't doing it anymore. The retailers aren't doing it. It's just kind of changing very quickly. And so that's why I say proficiency with technology and electronically stored information, those types of things. The reason I talked about those is I feel strongly that those are things that, we need to focus. I see some of my older partners who just kind of ignored some of that, and that's fine. But the younger generation can't and shouldn't. And even my generation, I'm all of us, but the ability to be proficient in those things is certainly, it's not only not going away, there's an increased emphasis on it. I hope that answered the question.
It does, definitely. Just to follow up on that, if I may ask, so the document custodian you're talking about, would that be an external facility that would take the original and then scan it and that would authenticate it?
It can be either. I've seen either do it. So there is a whole cottage industry now of folks that provide EDiscovery services, as I mentioned before. Those weren't there before. Maybe some of them have morphed. What used to be the copy providers, literally there were companies here in New Orleans and in every city that all they did was provide copies for lawyers like me, for litigation and copy services, those types of things. They've had to pivot, and if they don't pivot, that's an example of someone who didn't adapt. Why? Because the paper stuff is yesteryear, last decade. And so what some of them have done is they've been able to pivot and adapt and make their focus on electronically stored information and data hosting. There's companies that just host data for a fee every month. And that's what's happened and transformed in the industry. That was not the case 20 years ago. I mean, it was starting to change then. But to me, that's just an example of someone who failed to adapt. They'll become a blockbuster video.
Yeah. Okay, helpful. Thank you very much.
Great. So I have about 5 minutes left. Are there anyone else have any other questions?
I'm sorry we couldn't hear from Mark. I don't know if he's having audio trouble. Maybe he could, if he had a question, he could type it, or maybe.
He must be having some connectivity issues. He actually dropped off. So.
Okay.
So we tried with him, but maybe you can connect otherwise.
Sure.
So any other questions anybody has?
I have one. What you're saying that the law firms are starting to be more open to the idea of remote work. Would that be an accurate way to recap what you said earlier?
I can't speak for all of them, Cullen, but we have a consortium of partners from local law firms that as COVID started, my managing partner actually started it, and it's plaintiffs firms, small firms, and everybody was just talking once a week about what they were experiencing and how they were adapting. And so one size doesn't fit all here, and I'm not speaking for all of them, but yes, I think we found out that we were able to work remotely better than a lot of us frankly thought we could. There are some people who still have issues, either immunodeficiency issues, childcare issues with the schools being let out at those types of things. So we've found that we can work remotely. And I think that's just made people think differently about that whole thing. So is everyone going to keep working remotely? I don't think so, but I think a lot will. And I think a lot will just allow folks to not have in their face. I know one law firm that's rotating and having people show up in the office voluntarily, but they have two teams and they do that on a portion of the week. We're not doing that, but I'm just saying, I think it's an example of how people are being a little more creative and adaptive to the new world that we're operating in. And I'm specifically talking about COVID. But I think that's just a change that it's going to be hard to go back to requiring everybody be in the office all the time, every day, because we thought that if they weren't in the office, they weren't working, right? We've learned that we can operate effectively. And in some cases, as effectively. And I know some people swear they're more effective because they're able to, instead of dealing with commuting or the other things or going and finding lunch, that they're able to, be more efficient in a remote location. And I suspect if they feel that strongly, they're right. So take my vantage point for what it's worth, but I do think that we're seeing a change in a lot of areas in the way remote work is viewed. Look, I'll tell you, our clients don't necessarily want to come to our offices, right? And I'm not just talking about us. They're just fine talking by phone. And the days of the business lunch, with your client, I'm not sure that's ever going to come back the same way we thought about it. I'm not sure, but I don't think, I had opposing counsel who really wanted to view some documents, and it took him 4 months before he was in his 60s, but he did not want to come into our office where these originals were. And I think it frankly kept his client demanding it before he did. And if you think about that and what that's doing to the way we're operating, the way we're communicating, there are some witnesses who don't want to be in a deposition room with 6 people, including the court reporter and the paralegal and all those types of things. So the courts are having to adapt to people who want to have a remote deposition. Probably wouldn't have allowed that 10 years ago, right? That wasn't the same as being in person, but we're having to adjust to that, just like the courts are having to adjust with what to do about juries or jurors who don't want to be sitting next to 12 other people, or their court staffs. Remember, a lot of the court staffs, the judges are having to respond to the judge might feel comfortable being in a courtroom with 30 other people, but if the judge's assistant or secretary or law clerk isn't, what are they going to do? And so we're having to adapt in ways that we haven't think. And I just feel that the results of that are some things that may not ever look the same again, including fully in-house. Everybody's in the office all the time, in carols next to each other, about that. So I may be wrong, we'll see, but that's my bet.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much. And Chris, who joined us, thank you so much for your time answering our questions, and thanking everyone for participating. We got about 2 minutes left. So if there's some last things you'd like to say, Chris, please do so. And then also, I just want to remind everyone you can connect with each other through the app if you haven't done so already, or join some of those discussions in the community group. But any last words, Chris? Last thoughts, I should say. Last word sounds so...
I feel like I've talked too much, but I will say it's nice to see everyone in this day and age. I miss some of the interaction that we'd have. I know that you've done a great job, Nicole, in making sure that we can stay connected, even though that we're not in a room together shaking hands. But I will say I'm proud of Tulane and how well it's adapted to this. Some of you who are local have seen how quickly the school has put up temporary buildings and made everything safe for the students. And I know I'm biased, but I will say, having watched it, for those who are not here local, it's really impressive how well the school's adapted. I think some of that may be having hurricane plans and plan Bs that we've learned to have here in this region. And maybe that's a silver lining from some of what we have here in terms of storms and natural disasters and those things. But I am proud of Tulane for how it's done. I'm glad to see you all. I hope there was some value in this. And, best of luck. I hope everyone stays safe. So thanks for your attention. Thanks for your questions. And feel free to contact me offline if you'd like.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
See y'all.